So we're actually everybody's gonna kind of present themselves, but my name's Duncan MacKenzie, and we put this panel together to kind of talk through the unseemly relationship between art and politics. And so to do that, I tapped three amazing Chicagoans: Abby Satinsky of Threewalls and Incubate fame, Michael Rakowitz of Just Being Awesome fame, and Jim Duignan of the Pedagogical Factory. Stockyard Institute's Pedagogical Factory, actually. Sorry. So to do the kind of actual introducing their projects, they're each going to show 3 or 4 slides, 5 slides maybe. Michael said he's got a 30-minute video. So we're going to do that, and then we will get started with questions around what does art get from being done, or sorry, it occurred to me that was a vulgar joke, and I was going to probably not lead with a vulgar joke. I'll probably get there eventually, though. But what does art get from politics in terms of that relationship, and what does politics and activism get by being done in the art gallery? But I think Abby's going to run the slides because she's a tech wizard.
Is that my cue to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's me. I go first.
Did you want to introduce Bad at Sports?
So I'll introduce Bad at Sports. Bad at Sports for the last better part of the last 10 years has been, or for 475 weeks this Sunday, has been Chicago's contemporary art podcast and regular discussion forum on the internet. So click over to the next slide. There you go.
Okay.
Boom, done.
Okay. So, hi, my name's Abby. I'm the Associate Director at Threewalls here in Chicago. We're a nonprofit. We've been around for 12 years. We have a booth way on the other end of the fair, and we're selling editions. So one of the things that I thought that I would just start with was this quote that I was thinking about in terms of this prompt that Duncan gave us, which is from a book that Pablo Higuera wrote, and he's going to be on the next panel.
And he's sitting right there.
And he's sitting right there.
Which can't be embarrassing at all for you, Abby.
But to me, it's sort of a succinct way of kind of getting at, it seems like what you're asking us in this very broad idea of politics and art. And he's in particular talking about socially engaged art. But so socially engaged art functions by attaching itself to subjects and problems that normally belong to other disciplines, moving them temporarily into the space of ambiguity. It is this temporary snatching away into the realm of art making that brings new insights to a particular problem or condition, and in turn makes that visible to other disciplines. So I don't know, I've just been kicking around that quote a little bit in my mind as I've been teaching this semester this class on social practice and sort of thinking about the expectations that are put on artists to when they are working in a politically or socially engaged way to be sort of the best community worker, and that there isn't, sometimes we don't allow enough space for the ambiguity of what artists in particular can do and the kinds of propositions that they can put out there in the world, and a lot of the paradoxes that come along with that. So just in terms of my work, I'm very interested in how artists organize themselves and think about themselves as sort of a political constituency, and how they think about the infrastructures that they participate in and what they're asking from those from those infrastructures. So thinking about, how a museum is different from a nonprofit that is different from an art fair, like what are the different ethoses that artists bring to those things, and also how do they imagine political alternatives to them if they want them. If you're doing politically engaged work, what are the networks that you want that work to circulate within? So this image is from a gathering that I was part of in 2008 called We Want More, and it was here in Chicago. And it was this invitational gathering of about 85 people, and we gathered at Co-Prosperity Sphere for the weekend in order to talk about how, to say that there's all these artists that are working in political and social ways, how do we see ourselves as a community? What kinds of infrastructures do we see needing to happen to support our work, and how do we want to network together? And is there sort of a larger project at hand of this larger network? And in reality, it was a really big failure because we couldn't. I sort of sorry, I have a bunch of pictures of people sitting around rooms.
I have a
Because that's
slide rule.
actually all the people do.
My slide rule looks exactly the same way. Don't worry about it.
And these are just some of the notes from like the breakout sessions and things. But it was just a really interesting failure because just to think about like whether or not we, as artists, as culture workers working in different capacities, if we actually do share the same political urgencies, and how we figure out how to connect those things. And again, like what's the larger project? Do we want to change the art world? Do we want to talk about how we're impacting the broader culture? Are we working in concert with social movements? Do we want it to happen in the street? Do we want it to happen in the museum? Do we want our artwork to be taken more seriously as contemporary art? So those are sort of the issues that were floating around that room that really, I mean, I guess can't get answered. They're not going to get answered here. They're not going to get answered in that context. But I guess, yeah, I would see my work as sort of trying to figure out how to continue that conversation in general, and sort of figuring out specifically what are we doing, who do we want to be talking to, and what are the contexts that we want the work to be operating within. So just some of the other work that I do is, so as part of Threewalls, we're a nonprofit. We run sort of like a Canadian artist-run center in the sense that we have artists vet the exhibitions and the projects that we do with us. So we really see ourselves as a center where artists are picking the work of their peers and, furthering a dialogue around contemporary art based on what they see their concerns are. And so in general, we extrapolate that to do a lot of other things about organizing with other artist-run spaces and nonprofits across the country. So this is a conference that we do that's ongoing. It's called Hand in Glove. And it happens every couple years in a different city. We did it in Chicago in 2011. And essentially, it's a conference to have these conversations about what is the alternative sector today. Like if we believe that artist-run spaces or nonprofits or things are actually so radically different from an art fair, so radically different from a museum, what are the conditions and our politics and how are we operating? And so what are our strategies for sustainability? How do they reflect something different than a larger institution? Sort of trying to figure out where is the independent sector and what that looks like. So in this conference, we talked about regionalism, how art systems operate in different cities. We talked about residency programs. We talked about artist-run histories. So this is just one of the panels that we had. It's with Lane Relier, Martha Wilson from Franklin Furnace, Brenny Pritikin from New Langton Arts, and Mark Allen, who runs a project in LA called Machine Projects. So that's an ongoing project. And then, let's see, oops. Sorry, I'm just keeping this really short so that we can get to the conversation, but now I can't get this thing to do it.
But you're a tech wizard.
That is being disproven right now.
Oh, maybe it's Michael's. Is it Michael's?
Oh, yeah. And so this last slide is just is a book project that I've been working on, which is going to come out. So there's an exhibition happening in the Sullivan Galleries right now that both Michael and Jim are part of, called A Proximity of Consciousness. And one of the projects of that exhibition has to create 4 art historical texts that are about this kind of activity in Chicago. And my particular interest is this idea that artists have been organizing to figure out their own alternatives for a very long time. So if we think about the context that we're talking about politics and art right now, as if there is some renaissance of this kind of activity, I do think that if we sort of broaden our sense of what that means, then we can see really, a long practice of this here in Chicago and how it's operating very differently than it would be in New York or things like that. So one of the arguments of this book is something like how the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which is a jazz collective and education and school and association that's been part of Chicago for a really long time. It started in the 60s, and it was all about black musicians coming together to create platforms to support their own experimentation and new music. And so a lot of times it's associated with jazz, but really it's about sort of experimental music in general and how to create ways to create a community around it, create a context around it, create a frame for self-determination around it, and also create schools that then teach other generations to sort of be able to make their own music as well. So like thinking about how those kinds of creative infrastructures can inform how we think about what alternativeness is today, or being political today, or those sorts of things. Like that what are those histories that we tend to overlook in terms of thinking about sort of the political narratives that are in our contemporary context. So this book there's a lot more to say about it, but it's about 200 pages, it's about 20 contributions, and it's going to come out in November. So
so look for it at
yeah. So buy my book. Sorry, I didn't mean to end in that way, but but just trying to get through some of my current thoughts. So that's it.
Well, that's a great transition.
So from Abby to Chicago's greatest... Wait.
This is a picture of, from one of Jim's projects at the Hyde Park Art Center called the Pedagogical Factory in 2007.
Yeah.
Right, so from Abby to Chicago's greatest art educator, Jim Duignan.
Well.
He's like, not today, but usually.
Well,
it's Michael's turn.
Well,
No.
let's see if
I think that's just a title card. That's not the real thing.
Well, let's see if this moves.
Monitor. There we go.
Look at how quick that was. All right. I'm going to sort of summarize a little bit about what I'm doing with a couple current projects, but that book cover, The Pedagogical Factory, was an opportunity to, after a great number of years, to sort of really stop and reflect on all of this work where artists and educators and experimenters and laborers and people, a lot of young people that I've been working with around some of the quieter quadrants of the city kind of came together and really looked at these questions we had about, what's school doing? Could we experiment in structures of learning or sort of radical pedagogical practices? Could we implement those somehow? Would we need to then figure out, well, how do you build an archive? How do we develop this curriculum? So it was a moment to simply kind of stop and collect all these resources and bring all these people together and really, with Daniel Tucker's help, develop all this programming around what kind of city do we want to live in. That was really sort of the kind of direction of a lot of our collective thought. But early on, I was born and raised in Chicago, so I've been having questions about, neighborhoods and school and, contemporary art for a long time, but also personally about, and politically about self-preservation. The impetus for the Stockyard Institute was a way to think about how I might create a forum to work with different groups. And it was simply that. It was really kind of the development of this artist project that could be a bit invisible, that could include a variety of different people. And I've always been really interested in images and language, and I thought when I landed in the back of the yards about 20 years ago, it was this opportunity to kind of explore a kind of work that I've been thinking about a long time. And I think in the back of my mind it was about wanting to build my own sort of experimental art school. I know that was an impetus, but it changed dramatically when I started working with groups of young people. Recently, I'm going to highlight just a couple of very current projects that do also sort of include a lot of this kind of conversations I've been having with groups. Recently, I've been working with a lot of senior citizens around the city. Some of them have been in the two primary neighborhoods that I've worked in, which is the Austin neighborhood in the back of the yards, and sort of more recently Lawndale. But we've been looking at parks, we've been looking at play lots, and we've been looking at them both as sort of social centers and sort of activated spaces. They seem to kind of be in these neighborhoods as sort of a site of sort of contest. None of the kids that I've ever worked with in the back of the yards or in the Austin neighborhood particularly found them to be very familiar or forgiving spaces. They were really sort of uncomfortable. So we've been looking at the kind of landscape of the park. And our intention has been to really go back to some of these sites and think about them as kind of educational spaces. And we're working on, this is sort of really fresh, so it's really unformed. And it's part of the show at the Sullivan Galleries, but to think about building our own kind of park. A lot of this has happened with this senior group that I've been working with around the city. They've been instrumental as this sort of group of woodworkers in drawing up some of these stories about what life was like in the 30s and in the 50s and in the 60s, in my case, and using the park as a kind of metaphor and a site that, we expect to do some building in. This is the kind of group that has been sort of holding counsel around that project. And in the meantime, we've been building these forums where the senior citizens have been working with some of our young group, and we've built a wood shop in the Lawndale area to exercise some of these sort of processes of kind of getting these pieces of this park together. But it's really rather removed from the kind of early tensions and the political sort of fighting, of sort of being in the back of the yards. And I'm sure we're going to sort of talk about that. This is a swing at the Hull House. Okay.
I feel like we should skip me and just move on to Michael. Can we hop over to Michael and get to the meat of discussion after his 30-minute video?
While the transition is happening, I figured I'd say thank you for inviting us all here and being able to kind of create a live encounter with Jim and Abby and Duncan is nice because we've been having these conversations for a while. I feel as though some of the way that the question is asked of like, what do your politics get from being in my art and your art get from being in my politics, it's a little bit of a kind of screwed up Reese's Peanut Butter Cup commercial from the 80s revisited. But it's also, brings us towards this question of efficacy. And I'm not so sure that I feel so comfortable with art having to reside in that space of doing. I have different approaches where that's concerned because I was educated first, after being a high school artist and going to art school, one of the things that happened in the early 1990s is if you were a high schooler who wanted to go to art school, your parents convinced you to major in graphic design, and you could do your sculpture on the side.
Is that not still happening?
No, I think because graphic design has also had the bottom fall out of it. And so the question of efficacy comes up in design, actually communicating and having an audience and having it actually perform a function. And so when I think about politics, I think about the functional. But when I think about art, I think about the fact that it can be radical in actually resisting function, resisting instrumentalization, and having its own sort of autonomous language. And that said, my work does reside in a frame where the political is very, very much the material that I'm working with. Let me know when we have images to show, but it's all socially engaged art, right? The images don't matter. What? Oh, okay, great, we're ready. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, but this is Parasite. This is the first project that I really kind of entered into the world with, which was a series of inflatable shelters that I continue to make that are designed for the homeless using rubbish bags and plastic tape. So it's the material of urgency that's on the streets. Attaches to the ventilation ports of buildings, and the shelters simultaneously inflate and heat the double membrane structures in the winter. And so they're custom built for each person. So that project has actually evolved to also now distribute the step-by-step instructions on how to build these shelters into the magazines that are often written by the homeless like Streetwise here in Chicago. In this case, it's L'Itinéraire from Montreal. And so it puts the skill sets into the hands of the community that actually is affected or uses the project. And it's also an editorial about the project written by a homeless person is often accompanying this. So the critical discussion ends up in that community. In Documenta 13, I did a project that has been a part of my art history from high school. As you know, many of you know, Carol and Christoph Bakarjiev had a position of Documenta that was situated in Afghanistan. She divided Documenta into 4 different categories. One was siege, and so to be under siege, and what does art actually perform as not only an escape, but also as a function in a space under siege. And so she kind of took the cue of the first Documenta, which was curated by Arnold Bode in 1955, as a kind of inspiration. And when that first Documenta happened, it was in a city in Germany, Kassel, which was 90% destroyed during the war. So as part of the rebuilding effort, the question was asked, what can culture do to rebuild Germany? And that's kind of the birth of Documenta. And so one day she was writing on her BlackBerry, and she was starting to write Kassel. And she wrote K-A, and then BlackBerry corrected her from saying Kassel to say Kabul. And so it was like this message from BlackBerry, you know, to consider another location. And so the question of, like, what can art do in the midst of a space that is under siege came up. And an earlier project that I've done that's also ongoing, where I've been working with a team of assistants to reconstruct the artifacts that were looted from the Iraq Museum, came into play when Carolyn told me about her idea to go to Afghanistan. And the Buddhas of Bamyan, as most of you know, were destroyed in March of 2001. They were 2 monumental Buddhas that were carved into a cliffside in the Hazarajat region of Afghanistan in the 6th century. And in March 2001, the Taliban demolished them. Now, this is from the Documenta catalog, but this is a picture of me when I was young and beautiful, 15 years old, and I was a stone carver. And this was what I wanted to do with my life right before I went to art school. And so my instructor had shown me 3 different examples of stone carving. One was Michelangelo's Prigioni, the unfinished works where the figure looks like it's emerging from the stone, and you have this contrast of a high-polished figure and a rough-hewn stone. The other was the Treasury Building in Petra, Jordan, and the other was the Buddhas of Bamyan. And so my first stone carving, you can kind of make out the maquette over here, was a tribute to the Buddhas of Bamyan. So when they were destroyed, it was as if my entire art history had collapsed as well. So in this political moment was a very personal moment. And so one of the things, I'm not going to show the Kassel component of the exhibition, but one of the things that I did, the question came up of whether or not the project should involve rebuilding the Bamyan Buddhas. And I didn't want to get involved in making a replica. In fact, I didn't even know if the people there had wanted to rebuild it, but it turned out that they did, and UNESCO said no. And the United Nations also had another kind of group called ICOMOS, which was an international commission on monuments and sites around the world, also saying no. And so I thought, well, fuck it. If the politicians say no and these guys say no, then find a space in between. And so I went to Bamyan, and in a cave that was right near the head of the western niche of the Buddhas, I worked with a group of students from age, can we get some sound on this? Great. A group of students from about age 16 to 22, none of whom were artists, and we redistributed the skill sets of stone carving directly into the community. And so if they wanted to rebuild them, they have the capacity to do it without anyone's permission. The other thing that happened as a result of this was 3 days into this workshop that I was teaching, I had assistance from an Afghan sculptor named Abbas al-Adad, who you'll see in the video, who has a blue jacket. And he's one of Afghanistan's most famous sculptors, carves realistic human figures, and as a result, he was hunted by the Taliban, and he continues to be hunted by the Taliban. And I had the students more or less doing the same kind of like. I had shown the students the same examples of art that I would have shown my students here. So they fell in love with the work of Wolfgang Leib, who did this piece called Milkstone, which was basically a flat piece of marble, and you pour milk on it, and it looks like you don't know which is the milk, which is the marble. They loved Henry Moore because Henry Moore made a lot of stone carvings for his sheep, and they said, we have sheep, and so they were thinking of making work for a non-human audience. And then another example I showed them was the way in Bryce Canyon, the wind has carved all of those hoodoos that you see in the landscape. And so one student for 2 days had just blown on his stone, thinking that a hole might kind of break through. So in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, conceptual art is happening in this cave. And so when Abbas al-Haddad saw this, he immediately got the students to stop doing this and started drawing realistic figures on their stones. And he came up to me and he said, in Afghanistan, we have plenty of abstraction and obfuscation. It's the real that's radical. And so I'll end with that story, and maybe we can go forward with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, guys. You should definitely start with the real versus the real as radical. That was a tough endpoint, Michael. But you're right. It is, for me, there is this kind of question of efficacy, and the question of efficacy bothers me a lot all the time, because all the time I think to myself, what the fuck do you think you're doing? And I almost never have a good answer. And I look around at other people and wonder what their answers are. And so yes, this panel is kind of part two of getting to this question. And the first time I did directly ask the question of efficacy, and that panel decided that I was asking the wrong question. And the real question had to be about the relationship between the art world and politics, and that I should reconvene another panel to get to the bottom of that. And so I thought, who better than an artist who works through war, an artist who works through education, and an artist who works through infrastructure to kind of think through that relationship. And because we think about our art world, I think, as kind of an abstraction most of the time, and at its best, it's this space of poetics and experiments in form. And at its worst, it's a luxury consumer goods market that feels very tarnished, right? And so as anybody who works in that space, I always wonder about how we motivate content that we see as progressive or radical in the world in a space that feels so bound by its kind of luxury consumer goods market and its need for that part of the economy.
We're sort of in the middle of it here, right?
We're exactly the middle of it here, which is what made it feel like a great place to have a conversation about it.
One of the things that I was thinking about is like how you intervene or think about appropriate scale, because one thing that I really liked about the way, Michael, that you're talking about your project is that that there's all these different varying scales that you're trying to negotiate, and then you're trying to figure out your ethical way to deal with these communities where they're at, and also the demands of this sort of larger blockbuster exhibition. And so that is kind of the problem, is like, because I guess I just get a little bit confused about, like, that's why I'm sort of blinking a little bit your question, because I'm like, well, what art world are we talking about, like, specifically, like which, like this one, or, because it just seems like both, Jim and Michael's work, it's like Jim is also operating at a really, like, in order to make those projects have any meaning, like, you have to, you can't abstract the community that, you're interested in working with, that it has to be about a sort of particular kind of engagement, or else, or else you're just parachuting and, then your politics go out the window. So, yeah, I don't know.
It's a completely different scale. I mean, I
Yeah,
think I
scale,
work at the
totally, yeah.
scale of, like, family history, and I think a lot of this work around socially engaged art has to consider that kind of community history, that it's been happening in a lot of these quieter sectors for an awfully long time. But I think scale is kind of a perfect question, I think the social and political tenets that I've seen come out of the work, as I recognize them, they talk about this kind of, relationship I have with some of these groups that move, in our kind of very small space. Early on, questions about what I was doing there, how do I sort of impact or introduce work that comes from like my own curiosities into a culture that's it's very different, and it's been a kind of collision for a long time. But it's been it's been kind of extraordinary to think about. The work has, I think, really become about a kind of engagement with people. That's been the content. I didn't expect that over a long period of time. When you're present with these, with young artists or parents or administrators or other artists, that their lives spill out, over that time. It's been sort of really interesting to think, and I'm just kind of unpacking, as we've been talking a lot this month, just about how the kind of social political work does surface from this kind of socially, engaged art,
So for me, the question always lingers. Like for example, the Stockyard Institute, the work you guys do, kind of putting together students and teachers in underprivileged neighborhoods and kind of teaching in rogue ways, and teaching in a way that is student-centric and student-sympathetic rather than kind of informational aesthetic or informational sympathetic or kind of infrastructurally sympathetic, is remarkable. And one of the things that I liked about the Pedagogical Factory was that it sort of replicates that content back into the gallery, right? That it makes the gallery another kind of, or makes a complicit site. But I'd always wondered, do you need that complicit site, or does the work itself speak for itself in the legion of young people whose lives have been touched and changed through working with the Stockyard Institute? And what then do you get in bringing it into the context of the gallery world, and what's the value there? What's the value? Because for me, the real human value is that legion of young people whose lives have dramatically changed, and their families' lives who have dramatically changed through these processes. And so then I think about the gallery, and I think it just seems like such a flawed site to do what seems like such great work.
But also, just to be clear, in the point that I was trying to make earlier, is that it wasn't a commercial gallery that you were doing the Pedagogical Factory in. You did it at the Hyde Park Art Center, which is an educational art center. I mean, and it has a real history of trying to figure out how those different, how to showcase the contemporary artists that are happening, throughout Chicago, from Harry Hu to the present, and then also bringing in this kind of educational element and sort of figuring out where those things, are sort of happening. So it seems like a really important element to the project too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that finding those particular spaces is important. I mean, I do think about what it means to bring a project out into a different sort of context and how that reshapes the project. It always does. But if I can find a unique space, I'll have to say that 12 years prior to the Pedagogical Factory, I mean, we were using sort of abandoned lots and public parks and places where nobody went, except to go home. And so there was also this moment where we've been accumulating so many relationships with artists and cultural workers, and the Hyde Park Art Center seemed to be a kind of nexus, and so, as Abby said, a kind of central space for Chicago artists to talk about art and education. But I think Duncan, what you were saying has been kind of the hallmark of our work, and I think what happened was in 1990, a friend of mine, Michael Piazza, handed me a book by Paulo Freire, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and so that kind of body slammed me in thinking that, you know, if young people aren't participating in the construction of their own knowledge, you know, then what are they doing? And that became a kind of sort of a blueprint for thinking about turning the tables on what we could do. And a lot of the projects have been about exploring that process of doing things maybe, you know, in reverse, you know, kind of re-engineering the way in which we've been thought about how we learn, you know, and how we sort of process knowledge. And so you know, everything we do is based on a kind of collective set of questions. Yeah, and you know, it's worked really well.
And I think also just like with the how we learn sentiment, it's kind of not like the we encompasses both the artists and also the sort of educational, you know, sort of youth or other kinds of populations that are being educated. I mean, that there's like a kind of, you know, I think that there's this danger in sort of saying that the gallery is somehow like outside of our context or something, but that like the gallery is a site or you know, like sort of the exhibition context, which I feel is more what we're talking about than a gallery, but it's sort of about this kind of collective knowledge production within artists, like how artists also gauge their own responsibility and their own like, you know, community and like the responsibility of that community, like that's a public project.
Right. And one thought on that is that, and Michael understands this really clearly, is that, you know, there always is this risk of like reproducing or replicating something that's not kind of traditionally pure. And so these ways of building new schools or new spaces, you know, the art world is a kind of context for us. I mean, beauty is a kind of idea that we've been talking about. It's not that unfamiliar. What happens is any space that we worked, we don't just simply have a kind of exhibition, but we ask that space to sort of let us take over and use it as a kind of working site. So, and we leave something there, you know, whether we, in terms of developing program or having the young people have a place to sort of meet and work. But, so yeah. Mm-hmm.
When I think about these projects going into a gallery space, you know, even though Hyde Park Art Center has this history, it's still a nonprofit art center. It has white walls, it has concrete floors, you know, and I've often felt as though one of the things that you know, even though these are sustained projects with the Stockyard Institute and other long-term projects, when they appear almost like these prototypes, you know? It's sort of like, you say how we learn, it's also how it could be. You know, in a sense, it's sort of presenting a bit of a fantastical drawing, almost like a visionary architectural drawing. And the fact that it disappears is critical, I think. You know, the fact that it appears, it's like an apparition, like a ghost, you know, it intervenes, and then it disappears, and you can follow it up. But I think the more and more that these spaces kind of like start to pop up and to show these projects like Stockyard, or if I think about another project, John Preuss's amazing work, The Beast, this past summer, also at Hyde Park Art Center, it did give people a place to go. It gave, you know, students who were in high school who were writing poetry, you know, a place to go. But then I think it's really critical that they do disappear. You know, because then it's sort of like it disperses this, not just a responsibility, but a yearning and a desire. And I think that, you know, is one of the things that people can take away from an artwork and go back out into the world and struggle, you know, to create as something that's the norm and not just some kind of a visionary blueprint. And I also want to say that, like, you know, that question of like, well, you sort of said it before, like, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing? You know, something that the Yes Men said that I really appreciate was that, you know, when they were doing their newspaper projects, they did the New York Times, and then they did one later with the New York Post, is that if a bunch of people at the top can make bad news, There's no reason why a bunch of people at the bottom can't make good news. So the idea that we're working in this way, against so many different flows. There's like the political flow that wants us to disappear, and then sometimes there's an elitist art, criteria that doesn't recognize it as art and wants it to disappear. And it really is. The tensions are sort of like ratcheted up significantly. But I think this is, like when you were showing those images of like, people sitting around rooms, I mean, this is like, that's kind of a, it's almost like looking at this point, it's almost like looking at frescoes from like a certain century. They all look the same, right? All these socially engaged projects look the same. But that doesn't mean that we can't, sort of discern what's in the background and enjoy them, that it has become an aesthetic precedent at this point.
I like that idea that what we're really doing is trying to create or situate temporary models, like when that really kick-ass punk rock band comes to your town, so you're like, oh, that was so amazing. Why can't it be like that every day? And the only answer is you have to make it that way every day.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And you have to build it. So we get a bit of a late start, and Jim has to get to a wedding. So I am going to prematurely open up the floor to a couple of questions. But I think it's 2, because then we're going to be at time, and we got to get Jim in a car on the way to his wedding. It's not his wedding. It's a wedding.
Not my wedding.
He's just going to it.
Thanks,
He's having
Duncan.
cold feet. That's why he's here.
That's why he's here.
I'm going to stay here all day. No, not my wedding. Not my wedding.
Yeah. Ask it again into the mic just to make sure.
I heard you.
Like, is it important that they know you?
Yeah.
Or do
Not
they,
for me. I think I come in as, like I've said, a kind of just curious artist who's interested in, what people are working on. And a lot of it comes from, like, the senior citizens, these stories that I've heard them talking about, being at the Hull House as kids, or, playing in sewerage in the alleys before the pipes kind of came in, or just sort of romantic ideas of parks or being on the lake, or, I don't, I probably come in rather invisible. I mean, I don't have an agenda. I'm really interested in sort of what people are doing. We've been lately having opportunities to kind of publish some things or exhibit some things or record some things, and but we've always sort of been involved with that. I mean, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm curious too how people respond to the type of work. Do they accept it and say, let's do this?
Yeah,
or are they confused about the way that you work?
Not really. I mean, I don't have any pushback from anybody that I think I've ever worked with about what we could do. I really kind of come in very quietly and I think pose no threat. I just want to like build things with people.
One anecdote that I have is just that's been an interesting process for me is before I started working at Threewalls and doing this other work, I had a group called Incubate, and we would do projects as a collective around alternative fundraising and sort of how artists organize themselves, like this continuation. And we started this project called Sunday Soup, and it's a micro grant, and we raise funds for artists, and basically you come, you buy a meal, and then you get a vote, and who gets this grant. So this is a really simple proposition. And the point of that proposition was that, is that other people took it on as a model. And so there's various ways that we tried to do that. We had a residency program, and artists would come and stay with us, and then they would go initiate this in other ways. And what's been really interesting to me is, so it basically started as, now there's, 60 of them operating internationally. And this is, sort of they go in and out. So this is really interesting because now people sort of have no interest in the beginning authorship of that project, and it just circulates. And in some ways, that was a really interesting thing to be able to create a prompt that other people felt like that they could take on, and that that it doesn't have to be about tracing it back to some origin story or authorship, and that there's like different kinds of rewards when you initiate those kinds of projects out there in the world, that it's not specifically about, oh, I participated in this project because this artist initiated it. And it's really interesting because like I was talking to this other artist named Paul Ramirez-Jonas when we were doing About It Sports interview with him, and he was saying, oh, well, I do that project too. Like this, I do it with my students at Hunter, and I have this pot, and I like etch the names of each grantee in this pot, and it's like based on my grandmother, and it was just really amazing. And he was like, he said that to me, where he was like, it's an interesting project because there is no permission needed to do that, And so I think it's a struggle also when you want to do that kind of work, because authorship brings a lot of things. It brings legitimacy, it brings resources, it means the ability to go do it in other places, and those things have real consequences. But I also think that it's to have the ability to see something disappear is also was a really beautiful thing.
That's a nice way of saying it, yeah. I mean, I enjoy working that way. I mean, quietly, that's a nice way of saying it. That you kind of let it free. And I hope that the young people or the seniors or people who, other groups, just take it upon and, are able to kind of build their own things from it, I'm kind of a connector, or an instigator. I like to, help them sort of facilitate a form and then bring in all my friends. It's not a one-person operation. I mean, it's a great city to do this kind of work. It's easy. I find it easy. And that's a great project, though, Sunday Soup. That's really a great project. It's like perfect. It's like a perfect project. I thought it was
Don't blush.
At the beginning, too. Just because I knew it was going to be taken over by other people. And then how you deal with the aftermath is like a big part of this process,
Final question. You. Oh, hold on. Wait 1 second for the mic, and then everyone will hear you for sure. Go.
Okay, so Michael, you had mentioned before that, or you mentioned the sort of transition from like the high school art mentality to like a specialized education, or like the practice that you have now. And I'm wondering, this is a question for all of you, of course, but in these socially engaged projects, do you find yourself having to explain that same transition to the people you're working with who might not be artists?
I think every now and then, but it's as casual as a conversation of who are you? So many of my works that I do have so much downtime with participants, or collaborators, that the question of like, why are you doing this comes up. In the case of Parasite, the shelters, that project really doesn't happen without me getting to know a homeless person that I've gotten to know just by walking around the city, and the fact that we see each other all the time when we talk to each other. And so if they know that I'm an artist and then I also teach, and then they ask, what do I do? I mean, at parties I talk about that project too, because it's a good way of just kind of, communicating what it is that I do. But in terms of the transition from being interested in art in high school, I mean, people do often ask, how did you start? When did you start? And I think that the origin story, you were talking about the backstory and things like that, those things are just kind of like natural. And, your question ties in a little bit to the previous one, which was like, what do people think of it? How do they understand it? They're like, oh, I didn't know that art could do this. And I think that the people that I've worked with on projects, like on this food truck called Enemy Kitchen, for instance, it's like the people that I worked with really understood what I was doing. So the Iraqi chefs and the veterans kind of understood that art can create these sort of insurgent moments of resistance, with food. But then the people on the street, I don't want them to know it's an art project. I mean, I don't want to be, don't worry, it's just an art project. I want them to be scared, in some way of like the fact that they're getting this delicious food, but like there's an Iraqi next to a soldier, and the soldier's taking orders from the Iraqis, with how to like make things. And you're getting it on a paper plate that was Saddam Hussein's, so I want those moments of hospitality and disruption side by side. But I don't think you get that if you're prepared that like, oh, this is just art,
Don't
so
worry, it's just art.
Yeah, so I want that moment of the real in it. So, but I think when you're working alongside people, and people are working with you on something, I think it's responsible for everybody to get to know each other. They're not just extras in a movie, And so I think that what you're saying about how much do you explain? It's a really good question because it sort of asking like, what is the depth of your relationship? What's the depth of the interaction?
So the thing that I did not mention off the top is the proximity of consciousness, the thing that spurned the book that Abby showed earlier that will be out in November along with 3 other volumes in that series is really the kind of catalog buttressing an exhibition at the Sullivan Gallery in which Michael, Jim, and Pablo all appear. So when you are tired of the art fair, roll over to the Sullivan Gallery today and check out the show. It opened last night.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Thank you to Expo for having us. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you guys.
Thanks, Richard.